Most murderers want the case to go unsolved. Brendan Banfield wanted his solved. Immediately, that morning, he wanted police in his house within minutes. He wanted them to walk up the stairs and see a dead man on the bedroom floor and understand exactly what had happened there, because the dead man was going to take the blame. This is the story of a murder that was designed to investigate itself. A man who spent months building a crime scene the way an architect builds a house. The soundproof windows, the practice sessions at the gun range, the account opened in his wife's name. The invitation sent to a stranger who had never met her. The stranger's name was Joseph Ryan. He was 39 years old. He had done nothing wrong. He believed he had been invited. And when he walked through that door on a Friday morning in February, he was not a killer. He was the last piece of evidence. It very nearly worked. Brendan Banfield was a federal law enforcement officer. He knew what a crime scene was supposed to look like. He knew what investigators would believe. He was wrong about exactly one thing, and it took 3 years, 11 days of trial, and 12 jurors to find it. Herndon, Virginia, Friday, February the 24th, 2023. Herndon is not a place where this happens. It sits about 25 miles west of Washington, D.C. in Fairfax County, one of the wealthiest counties in the United States. Federal workers. Contractors, cul-de-sacs, the kind of place people move to specifically because nothing happens there. At 7:37 in the morning, a call goes out from a house on a quiet residential street. Then it goes dead at 7:38, another call, that one drops too. The third call connects, a young woman is on the line. Her English is accented, she is Brazilian, 23 years old, and she has worked in this house as the family's au pair for a little over a year. Her name is Juliana Pers Magalhaes. She is not the one who explains what has happened. A man takes the phone from her, he is calm, he identifies himself. And he tells the dispatcher that he has shot a man because that man was stabbing his wife. Fairfax County officers arrive within minutes. Bodycam captures what they walk into. Upstairs in the master bedroom, a man dead, gunshot wounds. He is a stranger to this house. Nobody who lives here has ever met him. On the floor beside him, a woman bleeding from multiple stab wounds to the neck. Her name is Brendan Banfield. She is 37 years old. She is a pediatric intensive care nurse, a woman who has spent her professional life keeping critically ill children alive. Kneeling over her, hands pressed to her throat, is her husband. Brendan Banfield, 40 years old, a special agent with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation, an armed federal law enforcement officer. His service weapon is in the room. In the basement, unharmed and alone, is their 4-year-old daughter. Brendan Banfield is taken to the hospital. She dies there. The bodycam footage from that morning was played in open court 3 years later, and what it shows is chaos. It shows a suburban house that looks like every other house on the street. It shows a front door standing open. It shows officers moving through a home that is, in every visible respect, an ordinary family home, school drawings, a dog, a kitchen mid-morning. And then it shows a staircase. At the top of that staircase, a bedroom that has become something else. The officers who went up those stairs walked into a room containing one dead man, one dying woman, a firearm, a knife, an enormous amount of blood, a distraught husband, and a screaming 23-year-old, and they had, at that moment, no way of knowing which of the living people in that room, if any, had done this. Downstairs they found the child. She had been in the basement the entire time. She was 4 years old. She had been told she was going to the zoo. The account that Brendan Banfield and Juliana Magalhaes give police that morning is this: a stranger got into the house. He attacked Brendan. He had a knife. Brendan came home, went upstairs, found the man on top of his wife, and shot him. Juliana fired a second shot when the man kept moving. Self-defense. A home invasion that ended the only way it could have. It is a clean story. It is a complete story. Every element of it can be seen in that bedroom. And for the first several hours, there is very little reason to doubt it, because here is what the scene actually offers on its face. There is a dead stranger in the house, a man with no connection to this family, no reason to be there. There is a knife. There is a grieving husband who happens to be law enforcement, who happens to have been armed, who happens to have arrived home at the exact worst moment of his life. There is a terrified young woman who fired a gun for the first time in her life. There is a child in the basement who never saw any of it. There are no signs of forced entry. But there is an explanation for that too, if you want one. And there is a man kneeling on the carpet with his wife's blood on his hands, sobbing. That is not a metaphor. Officers filmed it. Later, at the hospital, bodycam recorded the moment hospital staff told Brendan Banfield that his wife had died, and the sound he made was the sound of a man whose life had just ended. 3 years later, his defense attorney would play that footage for a jury. So the question that governs the next 3 years is not really what happened in that room. It is a stranger question. It is, why was Joseph Ryan in that house at all? Everything turns on that. If Joseph Ryan came to that house to hurt Christine Banfield, then Brendan Banfield is a widower who did the only thing a man could do, and this is a tragedy. If Joseph Ryan came to that house because somebody invited him, then it is something else entirely. Before the forensics, before the trial, before any of it, 2 people. Christine Banfield. She was 37. She worked in a pediatric intensive care unit, which is a job that most people cannot do. It is the ward where children are brought when the outcome is genuinely uncertain. Nurses who work in it will tell you that it takes a particular kind of person, someone who can hold steady inside a room where a family is coming apart. That was her job. That was what she was good at. Think about what it takes. A pediatric intensive care unit is not a place of quiet machines and steady numbers. It is the place where a 2-year-old is intubated. It is the place where a mother is standing in a corridor at 4 in the morning being told the next 12 hours will decide it. And in the middle of that, somebody has to be calm. Somebody has to change the line, read the monitor, adjust the dose, and speak to that mother in a voice that does not shake. For 11 years, Christine Banfield was that person for other people's children. Her sister, Danielle, would later say that Christine had a refusal to live with secrets. That she was honest to the point of inconvenience, that she was, above everything, compassionate. She had a 4-year-old daughter, and by every account she was besotted with her. And she had one more thing, a detail that seems small and is not small at all. Christine Banfield had lived her whole life with a blood disorder. A condition that made her bruise easily and bleed excessively. Her father would eventually take the witness stand and explain it to a jury, because by then it had become one of the load-bearing facts of the entire case. Hold on to that. It comes back. Joseph Ryan, he was 39. He lived in Washington, D.C. He had no connection to the Banfields. He had never met Christine. He had never met Brendan. Until the last morning of his life, he had never been to Herndon. He was born 2 days before Christmas, which made Christmas the family holiday, the one that belonged to him. He loved animals. He rescued dogs and then he adopted them. His aunt described him as the one who took care of the family. He looked after his grandmother, who would later sell her home to get away from the memories, the grief, and the reporters. His mother's name is Deirdre Fisher. She had him when she was 16 years old, which meant that, in a sense, they grew up alongside each other. After he was killed, she could not take down her Christmas tree. It stayed up. It stayed standing year after year behind the urn holding her son's ashes. I want to be careful here because there is a temptation in a story like this to sand a victim down until he is nothing but sympathetic, to leave out the part that makes an audience uncomfortable. So let's not do that. Joseph Ryan was, on the last morning of his life, driving to a stranger's house to take part in a violent sexual roleplay he had helped arrange over the internet. That is true. It is in the record. It is the reason he had zip ties and a knife in a backpack on the passenger seat. Some people will hear that and quietly decide he brought it on himself. Here is why that instinct is not just cruel but factually wrong. Everything Joseph Ryan did, he did because he believed he had been invited by a consenting adult. He had spent days talking to her. He believed they had negotiated it. He believed she wanted it. He went out and bought supplies for it, and he kept the receipt because he was not doing anything he thought was a crime. He was not stalking anyone. He was not forcing his way into anyone's home. He was answering an invitation that a man had written in a dead woman's name specifically to get him killed. Joseph Ryan's private life is not the reason he died. Joseph Ryan's private life is the reason he was selected. Brendan Banfield did not need a bad man. A bad man would be investigated, and a bad man's history would lead somewhere. He needed a good man doing something private, because a good man doing something private is a man nobody will ask questions about once he's dead. He needed a victim the world would be embarrassed to defend. Remember that Joseph Ryan is a victim in this story. Because for a long time, for the entire first phase of this investigation, he was not treated as one. He was the intruder. He was the man with the knife. He was the reason a nurse was dead. That was the point. There is a particular cruelty in this case that separates it from almost every other murder you will ever hear about, and it is worth naming clearly now before we go any further. Brendan Banfield did not just kill two people. He killed one of them and then he used the corpse of the other one to explain it. Joseph Ryan was murdered twice, once in that bedroom, and once afterward in the story that was told about him, and the third person in the house. Juliana Pers Magalhães came to the United States from Brazil. She started working for the Banfield family in 2021 when she was 21 years old. An au pair is a live-in childcare arrangement. A young person, usually from abroad, joins a family, lives in their home, looks after their children, and in exchange receives a room, a stipend, and a year or two in another country. It is built entirely on trust. The au pair is inside the family, inside its kitchen, inside its arguments, inside its private life. Juliana Magalhães was inside this family for a little over a year before something changed. By her own testimony, the affair with Brendan Banfield began in August of 2022. By October of 2022, 2 months later, she says he told her the plan. To understand what Fairfax County detectives eventually alleged, you have to understand what a man in Brendan Banfield's position stood to lose. He did not want a divorce. According to Juliana Magalhães' testimony, that was not a matter of sentiment. It was arithmetic. He told her that if he divorced Christine, she would end up with more money than he would. And he wanted custody of their daughter. He wanted the marriage to end. He wanted none of the consequences of ending it. There is a version of this story where a man in that position simply hires someone. There is a version where he stages an accident. There is a version where a wife disappears. Every one of those versions has the same fatal flaw, and Brendan Banfield, a federal criminal investigator, a man who had spent his career reading other people's financial crimes, would have known it better than most. The husband is always the first suspect, always, statistically, procedurally, instinctively. When a married woman is murdered in her own home, the first person police look at is the man she was married to. So the problem Brendan Banfield had to solve was not how do I kill my wife. It was how do I kill my wife and have someone else's body on the floor to explain it. The answer was a stranger, not an accomplice, not a hitman. Somebody who could never testify, never negotiate, never inform, because he would be dead before he understood what had happened to him. And crucially, somebody who would arrive at the house on his own 2 feet, of his own free will, carrying the murder weapon in his own backpack. You cannot hire a man to do that. You have to invite him. January 17, 2023. On that day, Christine Banfield took a selfie. She was in a bathing suit. She sent it to her husband on Facebook, an ordinary photograph sent from a wife to her husband, of the kind that exists on 10 million phones. That same day, that photograph was downloaded off Facebook. It was edited, and it was posted to a brand new profile on a website called FetLife. FetLife is a social network for people interested in BDSM and fetish communities. The profile was created on the 17th of January, the same day the photograph was taken. The username was Anastasia9. The profile was Christine Banfield's face, her body, and her home city. It was not Christine Banfield. According to prosecutors and according to Juliana Magalhães' testimony, that account was created on Christine's own laptop by her husband, with Juliana sitting beside him. And the thing Anastasia9 was looking for was very specific. Anastasia 9 was looking for a stranger, a man who would come to her house and act out a violent fantasy scenario, a staged assault. She asked candidates to bring restraints, she asked them to bring a knife, and she screened them. This is the detail that detectives would eventually find the most damning, because it is the detail that has no innocent explanation. Anastasia 9 rejected any man who wanted to meet in public first. Think about what that means. Anyone experienced in that community will tell you the first rule is that you meet in public, you have coffee, you establish consent, boundaries, a safe word. You do not go directly to a stranger's house with a weapon. Anastasia 9 was not screening for compatibility. She was screening out anyone who would be seen with her in public before he died. And while Anastasia 9 was shopping, the house was being prepared. According to the evidence the Commonwealth put before the jury, Brendan Banfield spent the weeks before the 24th of February getting ready. He took Juliana Magalhaes to a gun range. He taught her to shoot. He was, remember, a federal law enforcement officer with a service weapon. His own explanation for the range visits was that he had to qualify for his certifications and that she simply came along. That is a plausible explanation right up until the morning she puts a bullet into a man's chest. He installed new windows, triple-pane windows, in the house. Triple glazing does several things. It insulates, it saves on heating, and it soundproofs. A woman was going to be attacked in an upstairs bedroom of a suburban house on a residential street at 7:30 on a weekday morning, the hour when neighbors are putting bins out, warming cars, walking dogs. She was going to scream. There is a version of this detail that is entirely innocent. People replace windows, energy prices went up, it means nothing. That is exactly what it was supposed to mean. That is the signature of this entire crime. Every single component of it is a thing that, taken alone, is nothing at all. A man goes to a gun range. A couple replaces their windows. A husband leaves early for work. A wife's laptop is used to browse a website. A stranger buys lubricant at Walmart. Not one of those facts is a crime. Assembled in the right order, they are a murder. And on the morning itself, one last thing. Christine Banfield's phone was hidden. It was found in a kitchen drawer. She was alone in a house that had just been soundproofed, with a stranger coming to the door, and she could not call anyone. She could not call the police. She could not call her sister. She could not call her husband. She almost certainly spent the last minutes of her life looking for it. Joseph Ryan answered. He and Anastasia 9 exchanged messages. They moved to an encrypted messaging app. Over days, they built the scenario together as consenting adults believe they are doing. He was told what to bring. He was given the address. He was given the date. The date was chosen because Christine would be home. Friday, February 24th, 2023. That morning, 2 people left the house. Brendan Banfield told his wife he had to leave early. He had a meeting with his manager to prepare for. He drove to a McDonald's a few minutes away. Surveillance cameras filmed him there. He sat and he waited. Juliana Magalhaes told Christine she was taking the 4-year-old to the zoo. She did not take her to the zoo. She drove around the corner, parked, and sat in the car with the child, watching the house. Christine Banfield was now alone in her home. She did not know that. At approximately 7:30 in the morning, a car pulled up. Joseph Ryan got out. In his backpack, zip ties, chains, lubricant, a knife. In his wallet, a Walmart receipt for the lubricant. He had gone shopping for this. He was, in his own mind, preparing for a consensual encounter with a woman who had invited him. He walked up to the house. Juliana Magalhaes picked up her phone and called Brendan Banfield. Phone records show incoming calls to his phone at 7:37 and 7:38 a.m. The 911 call came in at 7:37. Read those numbers again. Joseph Ryan arrived at 7:30. Within 7 or 8 minutes, the time it takes to drive back from a McDonald's, Brendan Banfield was in the house, on the stairs, with his service weapon drawn. He did not arrive home and discover a horror. He was waiting for a phone call. Here is what should have happened next if the plan had worked. Police arrive. They find a dead stranger with a knife, a dying wife, a devastated husband, and a hysterical au pair. They take statements. They confirmed that the dead man came to that house of his own accord, carrying weapons, to meet a woman he'd been messaging online. The digital record backs it up: Christine's laptop, Christine's photograph, Christine's account. The story writes itself. Christine Banfield arranged a dangerous encounter with a stranger. It went wrong. Her husband came home and did what any husband would do. Case closed, grieving widower, nobody looks any further. That is not what happened. The first thing that did not fit was the 911 call. 3 calls, 2 of them hung up, only the third connected. If a woman has just watched a man attack her employer, if she has just fired a gun into a human body, she does not hang up on 911 twice, unless she is not sure what she is supposed to say yet. The second thing was her story. Juliana Magalhaes gave a statement at the scene on bodycam. In it, she said Brendan Banfield told her to shoot Joseph Ryan. That is a very different sentence from "I shot him because he was still moving." One is self-defense, the other is an instruction. The third thing took months. Fairfax County detectives kept working. And what a months-long investigation turned up was not a fact about the crime scene, it was a fact about the household. Brendan Banfield and Juliana Magalhaes were lovers. They had been since August of 2022. There had been a trip to New York City together. There were letters. There were eventually discussions about the names they would give the children they planned to have, and then there was the house itself. Detectives photographed the home twice. Once on the day of the killings, and once again months later when they came back with a search warrant. In the intervening months, the house had changed. Juliana Magalhaes' closet had been emptied. Her clothes had been moved into the master bedroom, into the closet of the woman who had been stabbed to death on the floor of it, and on the nightstand there was a framed photograph. It was a picture of Brendan Banfield and Juliana Magalhaes. It had replaced the photograph of Brendan Banfield and his wife. His wife had been dead for a matter of months. There is one more thing, and it came from an unlikely place, not a detective, not a forensic examiner. It came from the director of victim services for the Fairfax County Police Department, a woman whose job it was to support this grieving family. She was in the house in the aftermath, and she overheard the 4-year-old talking to Juliana. The little girl asked her, "Can I call you mommy now?" Juliana said yes. Then the child asked, "Are you going to marry my father?" And Juliana said, "I wish." Juliana Magalhaes was arrested in October 2023, 8 months after the killings, and charged in the death of Joseph Ryan. Brendan Banfield was not arrested with her. He would remain free for almost another year. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the strangest features of this case. Juliana Magalhaes, 23 years old, foreign national, no criminal history, was arrested in October of 2023 and put in a cell where she would stay. The man that Fairfax County detectives believed had masterminded the entire thing went home. He went home to the house. He went home to the bedroom with the new photograph on the nightstand. He went home to his 4-year-old daughter, the only other living person who had been inside that house on the 24th of February, for 11 months. He was not charged until September of 2024, and when he was, the judge who denied him bond used 2 words to describe him: flight risk and a danger to his own child. Why the delay? Because the Commonwealth was not going to charge a federal law enforcement officer with capital murder on the word of his co-defendant. They needed the blood, they needed the digital forensics. They needed the timeline, they needed a case that would survive a defense team who would come at it, as they eventually did, with everything. Charging him early and losing would have meant he could never be charged again, so they waited, and he lived his life. He was finally indicted in September 2024 for the murders of both Joseph Ryan and his own wife. A judge denied him bond, calling him both a flight risk and a danger to his own daughter. The following month, Juliana Magalhaes took a deal. She pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter in Joseph Ryan's death, and she agreed to do the one thing that would decide the case. She agreed to testify against the man she loved. Juliana Magalhaes' testimony was the story, but a story from a co-defendant who has cut a deal is the weakest evidence in any courtroom, and every prosecutor knows it. She had every reason to lie. Her freedom depended on what she said, so the case did not rest on her, it rested on blood. The Commonwealth's bloodstain pattern analyst was Iris Daly-Graff. What she told the jury was, in essence, that the crime scene had been edited. Point 1. The blood on Joseph Ryan's face was flowing in different directions. Blood obeys gravity. When it leaves the body, it runs downward, and it keeps running downward in a single consistent direction until it dries. If you find blood on a man's face running one way and other blood running a different way, there is only one explanation. Somebody moved his head while the blood was still wet. Point 2. The blood on Joseph Ryan's hands was flowing toward his elbows. Again, gravity. If a man's arms are down, blood on his hands runs toward his fingertips. For blood to run from his hands toward his elbows, his arms must have been raised. A dead man does not raise his own arms. Point 3. The blood on his hands was transfer, meaning it did not spray or drip onto him. It was applied. Something bloody was pressed against his hands. Put those three findings together and you are no longer looking at a crime scene, you are looking at a set. Joseph Ryan's body was posed, his hands were positioned, his head was turned. Blood was placed on him. Somebody in that room, after both victims were down, was arranging things, and there was the medical examiner. Dr. Megan Kessler performed both autopsies. 2 things she told the jury matter. The first is that both deaths were what she called rapid fatalities, that both Christine Banfield and Joseph Ryan would have died within seconds to minutes of the injuries they sustained. That finding does quiet, lethal work against the defendant's account, and we will come back to it when he takes the stand. The second is harder. Christine Banfield's body carried numerous bruises. On her legs, on her arms, most of them, Dr. Kessler said, were less than 48 hours old. She could not tell the jury whether those bruises happened at the time of death or shortly before it or shortly after. She was honest about that uncertainty, as a good pathologist has to be. But hold it against something you already know. Christine Banfield had a blood disorder. She bruised easily, far more easily than other people. Which means that marks that would be faint on you or me were vivid on her, and it means something else too. Her husband would eventually tell the jury, from the witness stand, that he had known his wife was interested in violent sexual practices, and that he knew this because he had seen bruises on her body. He used the marks left on a woman with a bleeding disorder as evidence of her secret life. And then there were the jeans. Brendan Banfield's clothing from that morning was seized and tested. On his jeans, analysts found 2 things. The first was fingerprint-smeared blood, blood that had been touched and moved by fingers. The second was cast-off. Cast-off is what happens when a bloodied object is swung. Blood on a moving blade or a moving hand goes airborne and it lands in a line.
Perfect.
It is one of the most distinctive patterns in forensic science, and it means one thing: something covered in blood was in motion close to that fabric. Christine Banfield's DNA was on those jeans. Christine Banfield's DNA was on the knife. The prosecutor's argument was simple. A man kneeling down to help his dying wife gets blood on him. That blood soaks, it smears, it pools, it does not fly. But Brendan Banfield's DNA was not on the knife that killed his wife. It was not under her fingernails. He had no injuries to his hands, and the defense's expert would point out that people who stab other people very frequently cut themselves doing it. Joseph Ryan, on the other hand, had a bruise and a puncture wound on one finger. If Brendan Banfield stabbed his wife 7 times in the neck with that knife, where is he on it? I want to do something now that true crime rarely does. I want to make his case, not sarcastically, not as a formality before the guilty verdict. I want to lay out fairly the reasons 12 people in Fairfax County could have walked out of that courtroom and said not guilty, because they were real and they were serious. And for 11 days, it was not obvious which way this was going to go. Reason 1, their own examiner. The Fairfax County Police Department has digital forensic examiners. The man assigned to this case was a detective named Brendan Miller. He analyzed Christine Banfield's devices, he analyzed the laptop, he analyzed the accounts. And his conclusion was that Christine Banfield was in control of her own devices when the new email account and the FetLife profile were created. Not Brendan, not Juliana, her. That is the county's own examiner. That is not a defense expert hired for a fee. That is the police department's own man, reaching the conclusion that destroys the prosecution's entire theory. So what happened to him? He was taken off major crimes. He was barred from performing digital analysis on any future major crimes case, and he was reassigned to the sex crimes unit. The commander who made that decision, the head of the major crimes unit, John Patrick Brush, testified that he did it because he found Miller's conclusions flawed. That Miller had made a basic error, attributing activity to a person when all he could actually prove was activity on a device. That is a legitimate criticism. It is also, if you are the defense, exactly what you would expect a man to say who had already decided what the answer was, and Miller never changed his findings, not after the arrest. Not after Juliana Magalhaes gave her statement. He reviewed his work and he stood on it. Reason 2, the 24 seconds. The defense's digital forensic expert was Harry Lidsky, and his testimony was the strongest thing Brendan Banfield had. Lidsky did not argue about motive or character. He did something much more dangerous to the prosecution. He mapped the timeline of Christine Banfield's laptop second by second, and he showed the jury that there were no gaps. If Brendan and Juliana were secretly using Christine's laptop to run a fake account, there would have to be windows of opportunity. Blocks of time where Christine was demonstrably not on her machine and somebody else was. Lidsky said those windows do not exist. He showed them February 20th, 2023. That night, Brendan Banfield's and Juliana Magalhaes' phones were geolocated outside the house, at a gym, between 9 and 11 in the evening. At 11:07, Christine's laptop logged into her work website. 24 seconds later, that same laptop was active on FetLife. In 24 seconds, Lidsky told the jury the laptop had gone from ordinary activity to activity central to the scheme. 24 seconds. With the two alleged conspirators at a gym miles away, and it wasn't just that night. Lidsky showed pattern after pattern, Christine's email activity flowing into Anastasia 9 conversations with Joseph Ryan back and forth within seconds. The same machine, the same session. No handoff, no gap. He also told the jury that the two-factor authentication code required to open the encrypted messaging app, the app used to talk to Joseph Ryan, had never been deleted from Christine's phone. His conclusion was blunt. Brendan Banfield's devices were not in the house when the FetLife account was created or when it was active. Reason 3, the witness was bought. Juliana Magalhaes was facing murder charges and deportation. She was 23, thousands of miles from her family and in an American jail. The defense entered 71 letters she had written from custody. In the early ones, she is devoted to Brendan Banfield. She writes to his mother, who was paying for her legal defense, and tells her she would give up her own life for Brendan's. I will take the blame for both of us. She swears she will never take a plea no matter what they offer her. Then the months pass, her trial is delayed and delayed again, she becomes despondent. She writes about her lawyer's lack of commitment, she grows distant, and eventually she writes that she expects nothing from Brendan anymore, that she will simply be deported back to Brazil. And then, after a health crisis, after more than a year inside, she takes the deal, and her story changes. There is more. On cross-examination, Juliana Magalhaes was confronted with messages in which she was negotiating with television producers. Someone connected to a Netflix production had approached her with an exclusivity contract worth at least $10,000. She had not signed it. She was holding out for more. And when defense counsel pressed her on the details, who wrote which message on that fetish profile, who typed what, who created the account, she could not say. She testified that she and Brendan both wrote in similar language and she could not separate them. She could not recall the specifics of creating the profile. The judge had to instruct her at one point to just answer the question. The defense's summary of her was 3 words: bought and paid for. Reason 4, he cried. The defense played the body cam. The jury watched Brendan Banfield in the moment hospital staff told him Christine was dead. They watched him break, and in the courtroom, watching himself break, he cried again and wiped his face. Reason 5. The physical evidence has a hole in it. The defense called their own bloodstain analyst, Leigh Ann Singley. She testified that the droplets on Joseph Ryan's body could not reliably be classified as cast-off at all, that the surface they landed on distorted them past the point of confident interpretation. The blood running in different directions on his face, blood he coughed up, he was shot, he was dying, he was moving. The bruise on Ryan's finger, consistent with a man gripping a knife. Brendan Banfield's hands unmarked, and there was the dog. The defense hired a forensic audio analyst who examined roughly a second and a half of the 911 recording, a groaning sound that the Commonwealth said was Joseph Ryan dying on the floor while Brendan Banfield stood there and did nothing about it. The defense's analyst compared it to a recording of the family dog. He testified it was consistent with the dog, and underneath all of it, the theory of the whole defense case, tunnel vision. That Fairfax County decided early who did this, that they built a theory and then went looking for a witness who would say it out loud. That they sidelined the detective whose findings got in the way, transferred the lead detective off the case, and installed a supervisor who agreed with the boss. That they squeezed a frightened 23-year-old foreign national until she gave them the words they needed. That is not a conspiracy theory. Every element of it was testified to under oath in open court by Fairfax County police officers. That was the case. That was what the jury had to get past. And for a long time, for most of that trial, nobody watching could tell you which way it was going to go. On the 28th of January 2026, Brendan Banfield did something his lawyers did not have to let him do. He took the stand. A defendant is never required to testify. The Fifth Amendment exists precisely so that he doesn't have to, and the jury is instructed not to hold his silence against him. Most defense attorneys in a case this circumstantial would have rested without him, argued reasonable doubt, and gone home. Brendan Banfield testified for 2 days. He wanted to explain. His account was this: he had never heard of FetLife, not before that morning, not ever. He learned about his wife's account on that website only after she was dead. He had never touched her laptop. Why would he? He had his own work laptop. He had his own phones. There was no reason for him to be inside her machine. The affair with Juliana Magalhaes, he admitted it, but on his terms. She came on to him, he said, while Christine and their daughter were out of town, and he, in his own words, didn't stop her. But it was casual. That was the word, casual. He told her plainly that he had been unfaithful before, that there had been multiple affairs, and that he had no intention of leaving his wife. He said he loved Christine. He said he wanted to stay in the marriage. He said Christine had her own relationships outside it, and that she knew about his. The trips to the gun range with Juliana. He was a federal law enforcement officer. He was required to qualify with his service weapon. He had to practice. Juliana came along because it was time they could spend together outside the house. And then the morning itself, he said he was at the McDonald's when Juliana called him. And he said that when she called, he believed he was about to come home and find his wife with another man, a man he thought she was having an affair with. He drove home. He came inside. He went to the foot of the stairs. He said the sounds coming from upstairs did not sound like pleasure. They sounded like pain, so he drew his service weapon and he went up. He said he found a stranger in his bedroom with his wife. He said he announced himself as police. He said the man told him to drop the gun. He said his wife called out that the man had a knife he could not initially see because it was pressed to her neck and partly hidden by her hair, and he said the man spoke to him. He said the man told him that she was his, that she had given herself to him. Then, he said, the man made a forceful stab and Christine twisted and fell, and Brendan Banfield fired. He said he dropped down beside his wife and put his hands on her throat, trying to hold the blood in. And he told the jury that she was still alive, that she reached up and moved his hands with hers. That she said she was sorry, that she told him she loved him. He said he was so focused on saving her that he could not call 911 himself, so he told Juliana to do it. He said he didn't realize she hadn't. He said he never saw the dead man move, never felt him strike out from behind, the blow that, in his telling, was the reason Juliana fired the second shot. That was the testimony, delivered over 2 days from the witness box by a man facing the rest of his life in prison. And then Jenna Sands stood up. She began with a question that had nothing to do with the bedroom. She asked him why, in the nearly 3 years since his wife had died, through his arrest, through his bond hearing, through hearing after hearing after hearing, he had never once told this story to law enforcement. He had never given them the man's words, he had never described the knife under the hair, he had never told anyone about his dying wife telling him she loved him. The first time any of it existed anywhere was in front of the jury that would decide his fate. She turned to the love letters he had written to Juliana Magalhaes professing his love. He conceded it. But he insisted on the timing. He had fallen in love with her after Christine's death, when the two of them in the aftermath had more time together, and he explained why. He said Juliana had saved his life. He called her a hero. He told the jury it is easier to fall in love with someone who has saved you. He also agreed that they had discussed names for the children they were going to have. She turned to the pattern. The prosecutor put to him that he had once had an affair with a woman he met on a fetish website, a site for arranging paid relationships. He disputed the characterization. It wasn't a fetish website, he said. It was an arranged relationship. She put to him that he had also had an affair with his best friend's wife. He said his friends weren't together at the time. Understand what this exchange did to his defense. His entire account required the jury to believe that Christine Banfield, a pediatric ICU nurse with no digital history of online dating and no history of infidelity, had secretly built a profile on a fetish website and invited an armed stranger into her family home. And here he was on the stand conceding affair after affair after affair, including one arranged online. The prosecution's closing would put it in a single sentence: the digital evidence cannot tell you who was behind the screen. But between these two people, only one of them had ever done anything remotely like this before. It was not Christine, and then she turned to the 7 stab wounds. Christine Banfield was stabbed 7 times in the neck. The medical examiner, Dr. Megan Kessler, had told the jury that both deaths were what she called rapid fatalities, seconds to minutes. And Brendan Banfield had testified that after those 7 wounds, after her throat had been opened 7 times, his wife reached up, moved his hands, apologized, and told him she loved him. The prosecutor did not argue with the medicine. She simply held the picture up and let the jury look at it. Then she asked him about the 6. By his own account, he stood at the top of the stairs watching a man stab his wife, and he did not fire until the man had stabbed her 6 times. 6. He was an armed federal agent. He had his weapon drawn, and in his own version of events, he watched 6 stab wounds go into his wife's neck before he pulled the trigger, and then she asked him about the towel. There was a towel in that bedroom. There was a blanket. He used neither. A man frantically trying to stop his wife from bleeding to death, a man married to a nurse, reached for nothing. He put his bare hands on her neck and left them there. Or a man who had just stabbed his wife and who needed his hands and his clothing to look a certain way when the police walked in, put his hands exactly where the story required them to be. That was cross-examination, and when it was over, the defense rested, but the Commonwealth had one more witness. The Commonwealth called rebuttal witnesses, and the first one was a detective who told the jury flatly that the groaning on the 911 call was not a dog. It was a human being. Then they called a man named Thomas Patrick Smith. Thomas Smith was Brendan Banfield's supervisor at the Internal Revenue Service. Remember why Brendan Banfield left his house that morning. Remember the reason he gave his wife for going out early on the 24th of February. He told her he had to prepare for a meeting with his manager. That is the entire architecture of his alibi. That is why he was not at home. That is why he was sitting in a McDonald's alone in a car, waiting. His supervisor took the stand and told the jury that there was no meeting. Nothing was scheduled. Nothing was planned. There was no meeting on the 24th of February, 2023. Brendan Banfield lied to his wife about why he was leaving the house on the morning she was killed. That is not a matter of interpretation. That is not blood spatter which experts can dispute. That is not a co-defendant's testimony which a jury can discount. That is a document or the absence of one from his own employer. It is one of only two things in this entire case that Brendan Banfield could not explain away. Here is the other. Go back to the beginning. Go back to Anastasia 9 and the men she was screening. She rejected anyone who wanted to meet in public first. The defense's whole theory required Christine Banfield to be the author of that account, a woman exploring something in her private life, arranging an encounter. But her father sat in that witness box and explained the blood disorder. Christine Banfield bruised easily, she bled excessively. She had lived with that her whole life and she was a nurse. She understood exactly what it meant. The scenario Anastasia 9 was arranging involved a knife. A woman who bleeds like that does not arrange knife play with a stranger. And a woman arranging anything with a stranger from the internet, a nurse, a mother of a 4-year-old. A woman with a child asleep in the house does not systematically exclude every single man who suggests meeting for coffee first. Only one kind of person screens for that, someone who needs the man to arrive at the house never having been seen with her. Someone who needs there to be no witness, no waiter, no barista, no security camera anywhere in the world that could ever place the two of them in a room together and prove they had never met. Someone who is not arranging an encounter, someone who is arranging a body. That is the case. That is what the 12 of them took into the room. The jury was 7 women and 5 men. They got the case at midday on Friday, the 30th of January, 2026. They deliberated for 3 hours and 14 minutes and went home without an answer. They came back on Monday morning. On the 2nd of February 2026, 1 week short of 3 years after Christine Banfield and Joseph Ryan died in that bedroom, the jury returned. Guilty. Guilty of the aggravated murder of Christine Banfield. Guilty of the aggravated murder of Joseph Ryan. Guilty of using a firearm in the commission of a felony. And guilty of child endangerment for leaving a 4-year-old girl in the basement of a house while 2 people were executed on the floor above her. All 4 counts. 11 days later, Juliana Pers Magalhaes was sentenced. Her plea agreement had bought her a lot. The Commonwealth, honoring the deal, recommended time served. She had already spent more than a year in jail, and the prosecution had got what it needed from her. The judge declined. She sentenced Juliana Magalhaes to 10 years in prison. Joseph Ryan's family were permitted to speak because she had been charged in his death. His aunt, Sanjita Ryan, said something to that courtroom that is worth sitting with. She acknowledged that Juliana had eventually told the truth, and then she said that this was not heroism. Because there was a version of this story where Juliana Magalhaes simply refused, where she did not create the profile, where she did not drive the child around the block, where she did not make the phone call, a version, she said, where Juliana saved 2 lives. Christine Banfield's family were not allowed to speak at that hearing. Juliana Magalhaes had been charged only in Joseph Ryan's death, and under the rules, that meant Christine's sister had to sit in that room in silence. She would get her turn. On the 5th of June 2026, Brendan Banfield was brought back into a Fairfax County courtroom to be sentenced. In Virginia, aggravated murder carries a mandatory sentence, so there was no real suspense about the number. But there was a hearing, and at that hearing, the people whose lives he had taken apart got to speak. Danielle Hawker, Christine's older sister, stood at the podium and cried. She said her sister deserved to be talked about by the people who had loved her. She said that she had sat in that courtroom for weeks and listened to Brendan Banfield testify, and that she had realized she had never truly known him at all, and neither had Christine. She said his testimony was the most self-serving thing she had ever witnessed, that he had tried to smear her sister with lies. That he had tried to rewrite the woman Christine was in a room where Christine could not stand up and correct him. And she said this, that as a sister she had not only lost Christine. She had been made to sit and listen to a version of her that did not exist, losing her all over again, piece by piece. She said something else too, and it may be the most precise description of Brendan Banfield that anyone has ever produced. He could have divorced her. He could have moved on. But divorce would have required giving up control, and control was always the priority. Deirdre Fisher appeared by video because she was too unwell to travel. She is Joseph Ryan's mother. She had him at 16. She had buried him. She told the court what her son would be remembered as and what Brendan Banfield would be remembered as an abusive father, as the murderer of his own wife, and as the killer of an innocent man. Judge Penny Ascaret then handed down the sentence. She told Brendan Banfield that what he had done reflected something far deeper than anger and deeper than impulse. She said it reflected evil, and that she therefore felt no hesitation whatsoever in what she was about to do. She said the disregard he had shown for the life of his wife, a woman he was supposed to have loved, was almost unfathomable. She said he had lured a completely innocent man into a deadly trap and had then carried on afterwards without a care. And she said that not once had he thought about what any of it would do to his daughter. He took everything from her, the judge said, life in the penitentiary. Without the possibility of parole, his lawyers moved to have the verdict thrown out. In June of 2026, the judge who had presided over the trial dismissed the motion in a single morning. Here is what I keep coming back to. Brendan Banfield's plan was not stupid. That is the uncomfortable thing about it. It was not the plan of a man in a rage. It was the plan of a professional investigator who had thought carefully about what other investigators would believe and who had understood something true about how we look at crime scenes. We look for the story that is already there. He gave them one, a dead stranger with a knife in his bag, a wife who had made a terrible private decision, a husband who came home 8 minutes too late. Every piece of it was in that room waiting to be picked up, and the reason it failed was not a fingerprint and it was not a confession. It failed because blood runs downhill. Because when you move a dead man's head, the blood on his face tells you that you moved it. Because when you lift his arms to pose them, the blood runs the wrong way and it remembers. Because a body that has been arranged cannot ever quite unarrange itself. He built a story, and the physical world would not agree to it, but I want to end with Joseph Ryan. Because Christine Banfield was murdered by her husband, and that is a horror with a long and terrible history, and we at least have language for it. Joseph Ryan was something we barely have language for at all. He was a man who rescued dogs, who looked after his grandmother, who was born 2 days before Christmas and made that day belong to his family. He was 39 years old and he had never met the woman whose name was used to write to him. He was chosen because he could be discarded. He was chosen because a dead man cannot say, "I was invited." And for 8 months, while Brendan Banfield walked around free, while his wife's clothes came out of the closet and another woman's went in, that is exactly what Joseph Ryan was to the world. The intruder, the man with the knife, that is what it took 12 people in Fairfax County to undo, not just to convict a man. To go back into a room 3 years later and give a murdered stranger his name back. Joseph Ryan did not break into that house. He was invited.